Poor Annabella, still alone.
Look at our rings, Adelaide. Diamonds for the chosen ones.
The unwanted stepdaughter.
They laughed at their stepsister for being unmarried, not once, not occasionally, but for years. At 31 years old, Annabella Brent had become the quiet joke of every gathering, every dinner, every ballroom conversation. Her younger stepsisters flaunted sparkling engagement rings. Their friends whispered behind silk fans. Even her own stepmother spoke of her as though she were a problem that had never been solved. And on the night of the grand engagement celebrations at Brent Manor, the humiliation reached its cruelest point. The guests laughed. Her stepsisters laughed. Her father lowered his eyes in disappointment. The room that should have felt like home became a courtroom where her life was judged and found lacking. Yet Annabella stood there with her head held high, because what none of them knew was that she had already survived heartbreak powerful enough to destroy her. She had loved once, she had lost once, and she had learned to endure. But fate was preparing a moment no one in England would ever forget. For just as Annabella turned to leave the ballroom and disappear into the shadows once more, the massive doors opened. A hush swept across the room. The most feared duke in England had arrived. And instead of noticing the celebrated beauties fighting for his attention, his eyes found the one woman everyone else had overlooked. Everything had changed from that moment. Before we continue, let me ask you something. If you were in Annabella's place, mocked, overlooked, and treated as though you would never be enough, would you have walked away, or would you have stood your ground? Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It truly means a lot. If you're already feeling for Annabella, and wondering what happens when the woman everyone dismissed finally captures the attention of the most feared duke in England, make sure you subscribe, give this video a like, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow more than you can imagine. Now, let's return to Victorian England and discover what happens when the stepsister they mocked for being unmarried becomes the one woman a powerful duke cannot forget. Chapter 1. The year was 1882, and Brent Manor stood like a proud crown upon the hills of Wiltshire, its white stone facade gleaming in the pale winter light, its tall chimneys curling smoke into a sky the color of old pewter. From a distance, it looked like a house full of warmth. From the inside, it was a house full of cold. Annabella Brent knew every room of it, every draughty corridor, every creaking floorboard. She knew which parlor window let in the rain when the east wind blew, and which fireplace smoked when the flue was not properly opened. She knew the names of every servant, from Mrs. Hodge the cook, who kept dried lavender in her apron pocket, to young Thomas, the stable boy who still believed in fairies. She knew all of this because Brent Manor had been her home for 22 years, ever since her father had brought her here as a child of 9, a quiet little girl clutching a cloth doll, still raw from the loss of her mother. She was 31 years old now, and she still did not quite belong. It was 6:30 in the morning when Annabella rose. She did not need a lady's maid to wake her. She had learned long ago that waiting for help was a luxury not available to her. She poured water from the ceramic jug on her dresser, washed her face in the cold basin, and dressed herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed these motions 1,000 times. Her room was on the 3rd floor, tucked beneath the slanting eaves, smaller than the dressing rooms her stepsisters occupied on the floor below. The wallpaper had once been pale yellow with tiny violets. Years of damp, the color of old cream, and several strips had peeled away near the window. She had never complained about it. She gathered her dark hair into a neat knot at the back of her neck, and studied herself briefly in the small oval mirror above her dresser. Her eyes were a quiet shade of grey-green, like the color of the sea before a storm. Her features were fine, her skin clear, her mouth soft. She had been called beautiful before, once, by someone who had meant it. She no longer thought of such things. She slipped out of her room and descended to the kitchens before the family stirred. Mrs. Hodge looked up from the stovetop with a warm expression and set a steaming cup of tea on the kitchen table without being asked. That small gesture, offered every single morning without ceremony, was the closest thing to motherly affection that Annabella had known in 22 years. "The morning list is long today, Miss Annabella," Mrs. Hodge said quietly. "Miss Violette has decided she wants a 4th table arrangement for the west sitting room, and the linen delivery for the party has arrived with 3 sets short." Annabella sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup of tea. "I will sort the linen before breakfast and speak to the florist before noon." "You ought not to," Mrs. Hodge said, low and plain. "It is not your place to do it." Annabella gave her a small, steady smile. "Mrs. Hodge, if I do not do it, it will not get done." The older woman pressed her lips together and said nothing more, because she knew it was true. By the time the family descended breakfast at 9 o'clock, Annabella had already reorganized the linen cupboard, spoken to the florist by post, rearranged 3 table settings in the dining room, consulted with the head footman about the evening's schedule, and supervised the polishing of the silver. She had done all of this without credit, without thanks, and without complaint. She sat at the lower end of the breakfast table, as she always did, and unfolded her napkin. Lady Vivienne Brent entered the room like a ship in full sail. She was 53 years old, and carried herself like a woman who had never once been wrong about anything. Her hair was an elaborate construction of auburn and silver, dressed high on her head, each morning by her personal maid. Her gown was deep burgundy, trimmed with jet beading. She wore her wealth on her body the way soldiers wore medals, as a declaration. She took her seat at the head of the table, swept her eyes over the room, and did not look at Annabella at all. Adelaide came next. Adelaide was 33, the eldest stepsister, married 4 years ago to a wealthy banking merchant named Mr. Gerald Foss. She had her mother's confidence and her father's sharp tongue, and she wore both without apology. She sat down, accepted her tea from the footman, and opened the Morning Post. Daphne entered behind her, flushed with the private happiness of the recently engaged. She was 28, recently promised to a baronet's son, and she had not stopped smiling for 6 consecutive weeks. Annabella had noticed that Daphne's smiles, which had once been natural things, had become something else since the engagement. Sharper at the edges, more frequently directed at her. Violette swept in last, as she always did, and her entrance was designed to be noticed. She was 25, the youngest, and she had inherited all of Lady Vivienne's beauty and none of her mother's restraint. She sat down beside Daphne, smoothed her skirts, and looked across the table at Annabella. "Did you speak to the florist?" she asked. "I sent a letter first thing this morning," Annabella said. "He will deliver the additional arrangements by Thursday." Violette picked up a piece of toast. "You could have told me first." Annabella held her tongue. There was no answer to that which would satisfy anyone at this table. Breakfast passed in the usual rhythms. Lady Vivienne issuing instructions to servants who were not present, Adelaide commenting on acquaintances who were not there, Daphne discussing her wedding arrangements, Violette finding fault with small things. Annabella listened, ate quietly, and occasionally answered a question when one was directed her way, which was not often. It was Adelaide who broke from the usual pattern. She set down her teacup and looked at Annabella with an expression of theatrical sympathy that had nothing of genuine feeling in it. "Our cousin Margaret will be attending Violette's engagement ball next Saturday," she said. She has just had her second child, a boy. How wonderful for her, Annabella said. She is 26, Adelaide continued pleasantly, and already quite settled. It does make one wonder, does it not, about other women of a similar age, or somewhat older, she let the pause sit, who have not yet managed to find their own path. Lady Vivian looked up from her correspondence and allowed a faint smile to cross her face. Daphne made a soft sound of poorly concealed amusement. Annabella kept her expression still and even. She had spent years learning to receive these small cruelties without flinching, the way a stone in a stream learns not to resist the current. The water came regardless. The stone simply remained. "I am certain Margaret is very happy," she said, and reached for the marmalade, but the comment had landed where it was intended to land. She felt it in the quiet place beneath her ribs, the place she rarely let anyone see. 31 years old and still unmarried. It was the single fact about her that this household used most reliably as a weapon. She thought, sometimes, that they did not even fully understand why it wounded her. They assumed she was simply a woman who had failed, that no man had wanted her, that she had been passed over, overlooked, left on the shelf. They thought her unhappiness on the subject was the unhappiness of failure. They did not know about Sebastian. She excused herself after breakfast, returned to her work, and carried on. The days before Violet's engagement ball were busy ones. Annabella carried them all. She coordinated with the caterers, reviewed the guest list for errors, wrote out the final table placements, consulted with the musicians, ensured the ballroom was aired and the chandeliers cleaned. Lady Vivienne approved everything and contributed nothing. She signed correspondence, nodded at suggestions, and accepted compliments on the preparations as though they were entirely her own work. The servants knew better. Young Thomas, who sometimes brought firewood to Annabella's room on cold evenings, paused in the doorway one afternoon while she was writing out the placement cards. "It ain't fair, miss," he said quietly, with the directness of someone too young to have learned to conceal what he thought. "Many things are not fair, Thomas," she replied, dipping her pen. "That does not mean they cannot be endured." He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that was very close to grief. Then he left, pulling the door quietly behind him. Annabella set down her pen, looked at the fire for a long moment, and let herself feel it. Just for a moment. The weight of it. The loneliness that sat in this house like furniture. Solid and permanent, and always in the same place. Then she picked up the pen again and wrote the next name. The night before the ball, she overheard something she was not meant to hear. She had been in the upper corridor, returning a book to the library at the end of the hall, when she heard Lady Vivian's voice through the partially open door of the sitting room below. She had not meant to stop, but the first word she heard held her feet in place. "After Violet's wedding, I intend to have her removed." There was a brief pause. Then Adelaide's voice. "Where would she go?" "A cottage somewhere, a companion position, perhaps. Something quiet and out of the way. People are beginning to ask questions at every gathering we attend. Why is Lord Brent's daughter still unmarried? What is wrong with her? It reflects badly, and I have tolerated it long enough." "She is useful," Adelaide said, with no warmth in the observation at all. "She is a liability," Lady Vivian replied crisply. "And after Violet is settled, she becomes entirely unnecessary." Annabella did not move for a long moment. The book in her hands suddenly felt very heavy. She was 31 years old, and she had just heard herself described as unnecessary. Unnecessary in the house where she had lived for 22 years. By the woman who had occupied her father's place at every table for 18 of them. She walked back to her room slowly, set the book on her desk, and sat on the edge of her bed. The fire in the small grate burned low. Outside, the winter dark pressed against the glass. She had always known, in the quiet, reasonable part of herself, that her place in this house was uncertain. She had known it the way a person knows the weather, as a background condition present but not dwelt upon. She had managed each day as it came, found small dignities to hold on to, kept her heart from going entirely dark. But hearing it said aloud, in that calm and businesslike voice, like removing a piece of furniture that had outstayed its welcome, was different. It made it real. She did not cry that night. She had cried years ago, all the tears that season of her life required, and she had learned to live past crying. But she sat in the stillness for a long time, and somewhere very deep inside her, in a place she had built walls around and filled with careful silence, she felt something shift. Not break, not crumble, but shift. She was alone. She had always been alone. And unless something changed, something impossible, some intervention from a world that had not been particularly kind to her, she would remain alone. She extinguished her candle at last and lay down in the dark and listened to the wind move across the roof of Brent Manor and told herself what she had told herself many times before. Tomorrow would be manageable. She would manage it. She always did. Chapter 2. The past has a way of living inside the body. It does not announce itself. It simply waits, folded into the bones, patient and permanent, and rises when it is not expected. For Annabella, the past rose most often in the late hours of autumn evenings, when the smell of wood smoke and damp grass drifted in through the cracked window, and the house settled into its nighttime silence. On those evenings, it was very easy to travel backward to a summer 8 years ago, when she had been 23, and the world had briefly seemed to hold something beautiful in it for her. His name had been Sebastian Montgomery. She had met him in the summer of 1874, at the lending library in the village, where she had gone 3 mornings each week since she was 12 years old. He had been standing at the shelves with the serious, focused expression of a man conducting a private examination, running one finger along the spines of books with a deliberateness that suggested he was looking for a specific thing. He had the build of a scholar, lean, with slightly ink-stained fingers, and a coat that was well made but not new. His face, when he turned to ask the librarian a question, was kind and open, with the kind of brightness in it that comes from genuine intelligence rather than performed wit. They had reached for the same volume at the same moment. She still remembered the small surprised sound she had made, and the way he had immediately stepped back and offered it to her with a self-deprecating smile that changed his whole face. "You were here first," he said. "The Middlemarch is yours." "I have read it twice," she replied, which was not what she had planned to say at all. "You take it." "Then we shall have to decide by some other method," he said gravely. And she had laughed. Really laughed. The kind that surprised her. Before she could stop herself. He had been the son of a naval officer and a schoolmaster's daughter, born in Somerset, educated at Oxford on a scholarship, and currently engaged in writing a study of Victorian botanical sciences. He had taken rooms in the village for the summer to complete his research, and he had no fortune, no title, no estate, and no particular connection to anyone of consequence. He was, in every calculation that Lady Vivienne made, entirely unsuitable. He was, in every calculation that Annabella made, extraordinary. They met at the library on subsequent mornings. They began, cautiously, to walk in the same direction afterward. They discovered they shared an unlikely number of thoughts about an unlikely number of subjects. She lent him a novel she loved. He marked passages she might enjoy, and returned it with a piece of folded notepaper tucked between the pages, containing 3 lines about why a particular chapter had reminded him of something she had said 3 days before. She had kept the note, She kept everything. The garden at the east corner of the village churchyard became their quiet place. It was rarely visited, full of old roses that bloomed through summer without anyone tending them, their roots buried so deep in the old soil that they required nothing to survive. They walked there on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when Annabella could arrange to slip away from the house without explanation. They talked for hours about everything that had no bearing on social rank or marital eligibility or the opinions of people like Lady Vivienne. They talked about books and science and the nature of happiness, about what made a life worth living, about whether kindness was a skill or a disposition, about memory and loss, and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who did not see you as he saw her, Sost. That was the thing. That was the whole irreducible thing, when she searched for the words to describe what Sebastian Montgomery had been to her. He had simply looked at her and seen who she was, not the unmarried stepdaughter, not the useful one who organized events, not the quiet one at the end of the table. Her, the person inside all of that, who had opinions and grief and a particular way of understanding the world. By August, he had taken her hand in the churchyard garden. It had been a small gesture, barely even an action, more of a slow gravitational event. His fingers finding hers on the stone bench between them, and then remaining there. She had looked at their joined hands and felt something open inside her chest, warm and certain, like a door swinging inward toward light. By September, they had spoken carefully, quietly, with the solemnity of two people who understood what was at risk about the future. He would finish his research. He would find a position at a university or a publishing house. It would be modest. It would be enough. They spoke of a small house somewhere green, with bookshelves and a garden, and the possibility of a life made from the things that actually mattered. She had believed him completely. And then Lady Vivienne had found out. Annabella had never learned exactly how. Perhaps a servant had spoken. Perhaps she had been seen. It did not matter. What mattered was the afternoon that Lady Vivienne appeared in Annabella's room without knocking, closed the door, and laid out the situation with the calm precision of a lawyer settling an estate. A man of no fortune, no family, and no prospects was not a suitable match for any daughter of Brent Manor. The connection would be ended immediately. If Annabella attempted to pursue it covertly, Lady Vivienne would have no difficulty ensuring Sebastian's current and future academic prospects were made considerably more difficult. She was smiling throughout the entire conversation. Annabella had not replied. She had written to Sebastian that evening. Not the full truth. She did not want to shame him with the nature of the threat. But enough. She told him that the situation was impossible, that her family would not permit it, that she was asking him to stop coming to the village for his own sake and to go on with his life. His answering letter arrived 2 days later. It was 3 pages long, and she had read it so many times she could recite it in the dark. He argued gently and precisely against everything she had written. He asked her not to decide in haste. He told her that what they had was not a small thing. He promised that he would find a way, that he would come back with something more solid to offer her, that he would wait for her if she needed time. He signed it. "I will come back to you." She had not replied, because she had known, with the quiet certainty that comes from surviving rather than flourishing in a place like Brent Manor, that Lady Vivienne's threats were not empty and that she would see them through without hesitation or regret. And she could not let Sebastian's future be destroyed for her sake. She could not bear to be the reason a good man was prevented from becoming who he was meant to be. She let the silence answer him. He left the village. Months passed. The summer ended. Autumn came with its cold and its particular shade of grief. She returned to the library, sat in the same chair, read the same shelves of books. She walked past the churchyard garden without going in. The letter arrived in February of the following year. It came from a colleague of Sebastian's, a man named Dr. Aldous Vance, who had written with the careful, apologetic formality of someone performing a painful duty. Sebastian had taken a position at a research institute in Edinburgh. The winter there had been severe. He had contracted a chest illness in November, and despite the best efforts of the physicians, he had not recovered. He had died on the 14th of January, 1875. Annabella had read the letter 3 times, sitting very still at her writing desk, with the winter light falling flat and grey across the paper. Then she had folded it, placed it in the small cedar box beneath her bed, where she kept the rest, and gone downstairs to help supervise the preparations for Adelaide's birthday dinner. She had not broken down. She had not told anyone. There was no one to tell. What she had done, in the months and years that followed, was make a quiet private adjustment to the architecture of her life. She did not stop believing in kindness. She did not stop being curious about the world, or gentle with the people around her, or moved by small, beautiful things. She kept all of that because it belonged to her and not to the grief. But she stopped believing that happiness of the particular kind she had briefly touched was available for her. That one door had opened, and before she could step through it, it had closed, and then it had gone from the wall entirely, so that there was no longer even the shape of it to trace. She had lived with that. She had managed. It was what she did. She managed. Chapter 3 October arrived, and with it, the engagement season reached its full, suffocating bloom inside Brent Manor. Daphne had been engaged for 3 months to Mr. Rupert Holloway, a baronet's second son with excellent prospects and a pleasant enough manner. Lady Vivian treated this as a personal achievement of the first order, and Daphne herself had developed the habit of mentioning the engagement at every opportunity, slipping it into conversation, the way a card player slips a winning hand onto the table, with great regularity and very little subtlety. And now Violette. The announcement of Violette's engagement to Lord Edmund Farley, a viscount's heir with an estate in Surrey and a fortune in government bonds, had been received by Lady Vivienne with an expression so close to triumph that it had crossed over into something else entirely. For 3 days after the announcement, she had walked through the house with the air of a general following a successful campaign. All 3 stepsisters were now spoken for or settled. Adelaide had her banker, Daphne had her baronet's son, Violette had her viscount's heir, and Annabella, at 31, had no one. This fact, which had been present in the household for some time like a piece of furniture no one admitted was ugly, now became a regular subject of open commentary. The combination of 2 engagements, 1 established marriage, and 1 conspicuous absence of all of the above made the contrast too available to resist. Adelaide began it at a Thursday luncheon with the gentle cruelty of the habitually unkind. She tilted her head at Annabella across the soup course and said, with the sympathetic tone of someone describing a natural disaster, "I do worry for you, dear Annabella. You are not getting any younger, and men of substance are so difficult to interest once a woman is past a certain—" "Adelaide," said Annabella, quite calmly, "your soup is getting cold." Adelaide's mouth thinned. She looked at her mother. Lady Vivienne said nothing, but the expression on her face was one of private satisfaction. It was Violette who made it a sport. Violette had many gifts, chief among them an instinct for the point at which ordinary cruelty became performance, and a reliable sense of how to gather an audience. She possessed the kind of beauty that collected attention passively, the way certain flowers collect insects, and she had learned very young that the most effective way to maintain an audience was contrast. She was more beautiful when standing next to someone plain, more successful when positioned beside someone who had failed, more desirable when the alternative was on display. Annabella had been Violette's most reliable contrast for the better part of a decade. The engagement ball preparations brought new opportunities. There were fittings to attend, and Annabella was not included in them. There were discussions about Violette's trousseau, conducted loudly, in rooms where Annabella was working, with deliberate attention paid to the subject of what one hoped to bring to a husband. There were comments at mealtimes, constructed with the precision of someone who had studied the exact angle from which a remark would cause maximum impact. "Lord Farley's younger brother is going to attend the ball," Violette said one morning, setting down her chocolate cup with studied casualness. "He is 22 and recently came down from Cambridge." "How nice," Annabella said, not looking up from the seating chart she was completing. "He is not bad looking," Violette continued pleasantly. "Of course he is quite young, but perhaps a man of 22 would not be bothered by." She paused delicately. "The disparity in years. It is only 9 years, after all." Daphne made a soft sound into her cup. Annabella continued writing names in her careful hand. She felt the remark with her whole body, the way cold water is felt with the whole body, but she did not allow her face to change. She had trained her face for years. It was reliable. "I have placed Lord Farley's brother at the second table near the window," she said. "He will have a pleasant view of the garden." Violette blinked. She had expected something more satisfying. She turned back to her chocolate. The days multiplied, and the preparations deepened, and Annabella was at the center of all of it, invisible and essential, in the way that water is essential to a household. Necessary until it is absent, never remarked upon when present. She ordered the candles, arranged the flowers, coordinated the catering schedule, revised the musicians' program 3 times at Violette's request, corresponded with the dressmaker, managed the household accounts for the week, resolved a dispute between 2 of the kitchen staff, and ensured that every detail of a party in which she would be displayed, like a prop in someone else's tableau, as the one who had not managed to accomplish what all others around her had accomplished. She told herself it did not matter. She had her small dignities. She had the morning tea with Mrs. Hodge, and the conversations with young Thomas about fairies, and the library and its quiet, and the memory of someone who had once seen her. It was enough. It had to be enough. The evening of the ball arrived at last. Annabella dressed herself in the pale silver-grey gown she had owned for 2 seasons. It was not the current fashion, but it was well made and fitted her well, and the color suited the quiet grey-green of her eyes. She had no diamonds. She wore a simple strand of small seed pearls that had been her mother's. She pinned her dark hair up with care and looked at herself in the small oval mirror and thought, "This is what I am, and it is sufficient, even if no one here will see it." She descended to the ballroom a quarter-hour early, as she always did, to ensure the last details were in order. The room was extraordinary in the candlelight, she had to admit. The chandeliers blazed, the long tables shone with polished silver and white roses, the musicians were warming their instruments in the far corner. Everything she had spent 3 weeks arranging looked beautiful. She stood alone for a moment in the empty ballroom and allowed herself one small, private recognition. She had done this. She had made this beautiful, invisible thing. Then the doors opened, and the guests began to arrive, and the evening began. It was Lady Vivienne who made the first calculated remark of the night. She was standing with a cluster of society women near the punch table when Annabella passed, and she turned and said, with a smile that was entirely for the benefit of her audience, "Ah, and this is my stepdaughter, Annabella. She has been so helpful with the arrangements." She has always been very good at domestic matters." She paused with exquisite timing. One supposes it gives one something to occupy oneself. The society women smiled in the way people smile when they understand the message beneath the message. One of them, a Mrs. Pemberton, with a face like a dried flower, made a sound of sympathetic condescension. Annabella smiled back at all of them with perfect composure and said, "Good evening, Mrs. Pemberton," and moved on. But it was the scene near the great fireplace, later in the evening, that was designed to draw blood. Adelaide had gathered a circle around her, which included Daphne, Violet, several younger wives, and 2 older men who laughed at whatever Adelaide said. She was speaking at a volume calibrated to carry just far enough when Annabella came within range. 31 years old and still unmarried, Adelaide said, with a little laugh, and several people around her joined it without even checking what they were laughing at, because Adelaide's confidence was contagious. Crystal glasses clinked, the fire crackled. At this point, Daphne added lightly, perhaps Annabella should set her sights on the gardener. More laughter. Even Lady Vivienne smiled from across the room. Annabella stopped. She had not meant to stop. She had been moving toward the far window to check that one of the candelabras had been repositioned as requested, and she had simply stopped, because the words reached her first, and her feet forgot what they were doing. She felt the heat of every pair of eyes in that corner of the room finding her. She felt the laughter like a physical thing, not a knife. It was never as direct as a knife, more like a slow pressure, the kind that builds until something gives way. She looked down at her hands, kept her face still. Then Violet stood, with the theatrical instinct she had always possessed, and stretched her left hand forward, so that the enormous diamond on her finger caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the ceiling in fragments of brilliance. "Annabella," she said, with sweet practiced cruelty, "you still have not admired my ring properly." "It is very beautiful," Annabella said quietly and truthfully, because it was. Violet smiled. "Do not lose heart, dear sister. I am sure some kind, lonely widower will eventually find you acceptable." Scattered laughter, a few pitying glances. Someone in the back of the crowd said something behind a fan that made her companions suppress a smile. Lord Brent, who had been standing to the side with a glass of sherry and the expression of a man who preferred not to be involved in unpleasantness, but was willing to endorse it, said, "My daughters have done well for themselves this year." His eyes found Annabella for a brief moment. Most of them. Silence folded into the room like cold air through an open door. Annabella looked at her father's face for one still moment. There was nothing there she had not expected to find. There was simply the familiar absence of what she had spent her childhood, hoping might one day appear. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin the smallest degree that was dignity and not defiance, and turned to leave. And the ballroom doors burst open. The royal herald's voice cut through every conversation in the room, sharp and clear as a bell struck in an empty church. His Grace, the Duke of Valahart, Duke Cassian Valahart. The room went still. Chapter 4. There were names in England that commanded silence when they entered a room. Cassian Valahart's name was one of them. He was 38 years old, and held the dukedom of Valahart, which had passed to him from his father at the age of 26. With it had come 3 estates, a fleet of merchant ships, extensive interests in rail and industry, and a political influence so deep and so broadly distributed that even senior ministers had been known to phrase their correspondence to him with unusual care. He sat in the House of Lords with the focused stillness of a man who had no need to perform his authority. He simply had it, the way certain things simply have weight. His reputation was not a gentle one. He was known as cold, precise, unyielding in business, unwilling to soften a position for the sake of comfort. Men who had attempted to outmaneuver him in negotiations described the experience with the particular rueful tone of people who had learned a lesson they had not enrolled to learn, women who had been drawn to his wealth or his face. And he had both. Tended to find that the emotional architecture within matched the external coldness of his public manner. He had not attended a social gathering of this scale in more than 3 years. His absence from such events had itself become a kind of statement. Invitations continued to arrive, from duchesses, from ministers, from anyone who believed that his presence at their event was worth the considerable effort it required. Most of them went unanswered. The ones he replied to were declined with a brevity that had, over time, come to seem like its own form of communication. He was here tonight because of business. Lord Edmund Farley's family controlled a significant parcel of property in Surrey that bordered Cassian's southern estate, and a question of shared access to a water route had been pending for the better part of a year. Lord Farley's father had shown more interest in resolving the matter, now that his son was engaged to a family of reasonable standing. An engagement ball was an appropriate occasion to meet. Cassian had come for that conversation, and no other reason. He stood in the doorway of the Brent Manor ballroom and surveyed the room with the unremarkable efficiency of someone cataloguing a scene: the chandeliers, the guests, the musicians. The significant number of people who were now very quietly watching him, as though his presence required re-evaluation of whatever they had been doing before he arrived. His face was a striking one, angular and composed, with grey eyes beneath dark brows, and the kind of stillness in expression that could read as either displeasure or simply the absence of performed feeling. He wore deep black with a single silver watch chain, and he moved through the room when he entered it with the particular quality of a person who has never once in their life wondered whether they were allowed to be somewhere. He gave his card to the Brent footman and requested that Lord Brent be informed of his arrival when convenient. Then he accepted a glass of wine. He had no intention of drinking, and positioned himself near the far end of the room, where the crowd was thinnest. He noticed the woman almost immediately, not because she was doing anything remarkable. In fact, she was doing the opposite of remarkable. She was kneeling on the floor near the entrance to the service corridor, beside a young housemaid who had dropped an entire tray of crystal glasses and was now collecting the shards with the trembling hands of someone who expected severe consequences. The room's reaction had been predictable. Several guests had stepped back with expressions of irritation. A woman in green silk had made a sharp comment about carelessness. One of the footmen had appeared with the clear intention of removing the distressed maid as quickly as possible before the guests were further inconvenienced. The woman in the pale grey gown had simply knelt down, without any visible consideration of whether this was appropriate behavior, and began collecting the larger shards with careful hands to make the task smaller. "It is all right," Cassian heard her say to the maid, low and steady as he watched from across the room. "No one was hurt. That is the only thing that matters." The maid was shaking. The woman in grey placed one hand briefly on her arm, a small grounding gesture, and said something he could not hear from this distance, and the shaking gradually stilled. It was perhaps 60 seconds of his evening. He had no explanation for why it stayed with him. She rose when the mess was cleared, said something quiet to the footman, and turned back toward the room. And for the first time, he saw her face clearly. She was not young by the usual calculations of ballrooms. She was not performing anything for anyone. Her features were composed, fine, and carried a particular quality he struggled for a moment to name before he recognized it. The quality of a person who has survived substantial disappointment without becoming diminished by it. There was something in the line of her, in the steadiness of her grey-green eyes and the set of her jaw, that was both fragile and entirely unbreakable. Cassian Veilahart, who had taught himself over the course of several difficult years to be essentially unmoved by people, was moved. He did not act on it. He stood where he was, watched her move through the room, and asked himself what it was. He was observing with the analytical detachment that was his oldest and most reliable defense. He had a reason to be detached. He had a history with this particular variety of feeling, and it had not served him. Lady Celeste Hawthorne had been 24 years old when he had met her, and she had been the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he had made the significant mistake of believing that beauty of that particular order must correspond to an equal depth of character. He had been 31, and he had not yet fully understood that some people present their finest qualities the way property developers present the facade of a building for the purpose of sale rather than the purpose of habitation. She had been engaged to him for 11 months. During 9 of those 11 months, she had been conducting a private arrangement with a diplomat named Lord Henry Ashfield, a fact that emerged not gradually, but all at once, publicly, at a garden party attended by 47 people, in a manner so complete and so perfectly timed that Cassian had spent the subsequent weeks asking himself whether the public nature of it had been incidental or designed. He had concluded, designed. Society had responded with the usual mix of sympathy offered to his face and amusement reserved for behind his back. The amusement had not lasted long, because he had responded to the entire situation with a cold, controlled silence that made clear very quickly that he was not a man anyone ought to pity, but it had taught him something that he had not previously known. That the place in him capable of real feeling, not the performed warmth of public, men but actual, private, specific feeling, was vulnerable in a way that nothing else in his life was vulnerable. He had closed it down. He had been, in the years since, perfectly content. Content. He turned back to surveying the room and found Lord Farley's father near the fireplace and made his way toward him. The conversation was productive. The water route issue was substantially closer to resolution within 20 minutes, and Lord Farley Sr. shook Cassian's hand with the heartfelt enthusiasm of a man who had just avoided a prolonged legal difficulty. The reasons for the evening's visit were therefore complete, and Cassian was perfectly free to leave. He did not leave. He found a position from which he could observe the room without appearing to observe it, and he watched the woman in the pale grey gown. She moved through the crowd the way someone moves through a space they have built themselves, with quiet authority and no desire for acknowledgement. He watched her adjust a candelabra with a small, precise movement. He watched her speak briefly to a musician who nodded and altered the tempo of the piece they were playing. He watched her refill a guest's glass before the footman could reach it, so smoothly that the guest barely noticed. She did everything that needed doing without being asked, without fuss, without the need for anyone to see her doing it. He found himself thinking, whoever she is, she has made this whole evening possible, and no one here knows it. Then he watched the scene by the fireplace unfold. He had been aware of the woman in green, Adelaide Foss. He had been told her name in passing earlier in the evening, making commentary that carried the tone of someone enjoying a private amusement at another's expense. He had not until that moment connected the subject of the commentary to the woman in grey. He heard the laughter. He watched the diamond ring extended toward the grey gown. He watched the father's cold glance and cold words. He watched the woman in grey stand absolutely still, spine perfectly upright, head lifted just the necessary degree, face composed and immovable, and he understood something about what he was watching. He was watching someone who had sustained this for a very long time. There is a quality in certain kinds of pain, the kind that is administered slowly and regularly over years rather than delivered in one blow, that changes the shape of a person without breaking them. What it produces, in the people with the necessary depth to survive it, is a particular form of dignity. Not the dignity of position or wealth. The dignity of the person who has been offered every reason to become lesser and has refused. He recognized it. He did not know her name yet, but he recognized what he was looking at. He set down his untouched wineglass and made a decision that surprised him. He had not made a decision like it in 7 years. Chapter 5. She had turned to leave. That was the detail Annabella would return to afterward, in the quiet of her own room, and in the weeks that followed, with the particular quality of a memory that demands to be examined rather than simply stored. She had been in the act of leaving, her back to the fireplace group, her feet already moving toward the far corridor, toward the refuge of practical tasks and the kind of invisibility she had always known how to find, when something made her stop. Not a sound, not a touch. She would not have been able to explain it. She turned back. The entire ballroom, which had been in full cheerful motion a moment ago, had gone very quiet in the way a room goes quiet when it becomes aware of something happening that no one expected. Women turned their heads. Men shifted their positions. Fans stopped moving. The musicians, attuned to the mood of a room in the way musicians are, let the waltz they were playing wind down into a murmur. He was crossing the ballroom floor. She knew who he was. Everyone in England knew who he was. His portrait had been in the illustrated papers twice in the past year. Once in connection with his industrial interests, and once in connection with a bill before the House of Lords that bore his name. He was taller than she had expected from portraits, and the coldness of his public reputation was present in his face in a way that portraits only part conveyed. It was not the coldness of disinterest, but of very deliberate containment. The face of a man who had chosen exactly what to allow into his expression and had left out everything else. Every woman in the room understood where he was going. Every woman in the room was wrong. He stopped before her. She could count on one hand the times she had been, in this house, the fixed point around which a room reorganized itself. The arithmetic of this moment, the most feared duke in England, who had ignored every duchess and countess and beautiful young woman who had angled toward him for the past hour, standing before her, in the full sight of every person who had laughed not 5 minutes ago, was so extraordinary that her mind did not entirely accept it for a moment. His grey eyes met hers. They were calm and direct and contained nothing of performance. "Miss Brent," he said. His voice was low, even, with the quality of a man who never needed to raise it to be heard. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Behind her, she heard Adelaide make a small, involuntary sound. She felt the silence of the room like a held breath. She looked at him, this man whose name made noblemen check their correspondence twice before sending it, and found, to her great and complete surprise, that she was not frightened. She was not overwhelmed. She was something she had not expected at all. She was curious. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, with a steadiness she did not have to manufacture. "I would be glad to." He offered his hand. She placed hers in it. The room exhaled. She was not an inexperienced dancer. She had learned as a girl, and she had practiced enough in the years since to be competent, though there had rarely been much occasion to use the skill. What she had not expected was the ease of it. He was a precise, controlled dancer, which she had anticipated. What she had not anticipated was the way that precision communicated itself to a partner, not as rigidity, but as steadiness. She felt no anxiety about where she was in the room or what her feet were doing. She simply moved, and he was there. He did not speak immediately, which she found she did not mind. There was something in the silence between them that was not the silence of discomfort. After a turn of the floor, he said, "You arranged this evening." It was not a question. "The household arrangements, yes," she said. "The chandeliers," he said. "The table placements. The musician's program. The flowers." She looked at him briefly with genuine interest. "You noticed all of that." "I notice things," he said simply. A pause. Another turn. "You helped the maid," he said, "with the glasses." She was frightened, Annabella said. There was no reason for her to be more frightened than she already was. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, but present. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that exists in the space just before a smile, in someone who has learned not to arrive at one too quickly. "May I ask you something, Miss Brent?" he said. "You may." The remarks made earlier this evening. He did not elaborate, and he did not need to. "You did not leave the room. You held your ground." She considered how to answer this truthfully. "I was about to leave," she said. Then it seemed too much like agreement. He looked at her. The grey eyes, which she had read as cold from a distance, were not cold at close range. They were precise, and measuring, and very attentive, in the way the eyes of a person are attentive when they are genuinely interested, rather than merely polite. "That," he said quietly, "is the most dignified answer I have heard to a difficult question in quite some time." She felt the warmth of it move through her like a current, quiet and real, and she recognized it, the way one recognizes something seen once long ago in different light. Not quite hope. Something before hope, the possibility of the possibility. "You are more than what they see you as," he said. Not a compliment. A statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of a man who had formed a considered opinion. She held his gaze and said the truest thing she could think of. "You have known me for precisely the length of one waltz, Your Grace." Something changed in his face then. The contained, precise surface of it cracked, just slightly, and through the crack came something unexpected. A real smile, brief and genuine and entirely unguarded, there and then, gone, leaving behind it a warmth that changed the whole atmosphere of the space between them. "That is also a very good answer," he said. At the edge of the dance floor, she was dimly aware of several things simultaneously. That Violette was watching, with an expression she had never worn before. That Adelaide had gone very still. That Lady Vivienne was speaking to someone with a brightness in her manner that had not been there 20 minutes ago. That Lady Celeste Hawthorne, she recognized her from the illustrated papers, was standing near the east wall in a gown of deep gold silk, watching the dance floor with an expression that no amount of social training had been sufficient to fully conceal. None of it touched her. She was here, in this dance, in this entirely improbable moment, with this entirely unexpected man who had looked at her and spoken to her as though she were exactly who she was, who had seen what she had done with this evening and named it. The waltz ended. He held her hand one moment past the final note. "Thank you, Miss Brent," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied. He released her hand. The room resumed its noise, somewhat higher pitched than before. She moved back toward the edge of the floor and stood where she had always stood, at the margin of things, in the quiet, useful space at the side of events. Except that now, across the room, she could feel where he was. She did not look. She did not need to. She simply knew. And England, as promised, began to talk. Chapter 6, within 48 hours, the story of the dance had spread through the whole available network of London society, by letter, by morning call, by the kind of whispered cascade that travels faster than any newspaper when the material is sufficiently astonishing. The Duke of Valahart had danced with the Brent stepdaughter. The unmarried one. The one who was 31 years old. The one whom everyone knew was the difficult one. The one who had never managed to secure a match. The one whose own family treated as a convenient embarrassment. The Duke of Valahart, who had not danced at a social event in 3 years. London considered this information from every available angle and arrived at several different conclusions simultaneously, which was typical of London. Some said he had merely taken pity on her. Some said he had misunderstood the social geometry of the room and made an error in judgment. Some said it was a political gesture, a demonstration of independence from social expectation. A very few, the most quietly perceptive, suspected that something had happened in that dance that neither party could have predicted and waited to see what would follow. What followed was Cassian Valahart returning to Brent Manor on Wednesday. He sent his card the morning before, which was proper. Lady Vivienne received it and spent the intervening 24 hours in a state of barely controlled social agitation that expressed itself as extreme, sudden, and entirely unprecedented warmth toward Annabella. "Annabella, you look pale. Eat more at breakfast. Annabella, that grey gown is charming, but perhaps the blue would suit you better today. Annabella, you ought not to work so hard in the mornings. Leave the household matters to Mrs. Hodge." Annabella observed all of this with a private, careful wariness. Lady Vivienne's kindness was a mechanism, not a sentiment, and its sudden appearance was more alarming, in its way, than her usual coldness. He arrived on Wednesday afternoon at 2:30. Lady Vivienne arranged herself in the front parlour with a speed and determination that would have been impressive under ordinary circumstances. Adelaide, who had contrived to be visiting for the day, positioned herself on the settee with the appearance of someone who just happened to be there. Cassian Valahart was shown into the parlour, greeted Lady Vivienne with practiced courtesy, and then said, with a directness that admitted of no misinterpretation, "I had hoped to speak with Miss Brent, if she is available." Lady Vivienne smiled as though this were entirely natural and something she had personally arranged. "Of course, Annabella dear." And that was the beginning. He came again on Friday. On the following Tuesday, he sent a note requesting whether Annabella might be available for a walk in the grounds if the weather permitted. It permitted. They walked for an hour along the garden paths in the cold November air, with Mrs. Hodge watching from the kitchen window, with an expression that was equal parts relief and prayer. The conversations were unlike anything Annabella had experience of in recent years. He was not making calls to be seen making them, or performing the expected rituals of courtship as social obligation. He was quite simply interested. He asked her questions about the books she read, and then engaged with her answers with the genuine attention of someone who was listening rather than waiting to speak. He told her, in the measured way of someone not accustomed to disclosure, small things about the estates and their management, about the complexity of the parliamentary work, about the parts of his public life that occupied him and the parts that did not. He did not explain himself constantly or make unnecessary apologies for his manner. He was who he was, with a directness that she found, to her surprise, deeply restful. There was a library call on Thursday, where they discovered simultaneously that they both owned the same edition of the same volume of natural philosophy, and had both made annotations in the same margins. He held the pages up with an expression that was as close to delighted as his face seemed willing to travel, and she found herself laughing in the same way she had not laughed for a very long time. From somewhere real, without planning it. There were carriage rides, when the weather worsened, where the confined space of the carriage and the sound of rain on the roof created a kind of privacy that large public rooms do not offer, and in which things were said with more ease than they would otherwise have been. He told her about the estates in winter, and she told him about the garden at the churchyard in the village, and neither of them said more than they intended to. But both of them said more than they had expected. He had not touched her hand again since the dance. But there were moments when they walked at close range, or when he leaned to look at a passage she was showing him in a book, or when the carriage turned a corner, and the natural movement of the vehicle brought his shoulder briefly against hers. When the awareness of his closeness was so specific and so present that she had to make a deliberate, internal decision not to let it show. She suspected he was making the same decision. Meanwhile, Brent Manor was reorganizing its emotional architecture at speed. Lady Vivienne's sudden warmth had now extended to Annabella's breakfast portions, the temperature of her rooms, and the quality of the candles she was given. This was grotesque enough to require daily management on Annabella's part, who took the small kindnesses with the neutrality of someone receiving them under protest. The stepsisters were another matter entirely. Adelaide's reaction was resentment. She was the eldest, she was settled, and she was the recognized social success of the family. The idea that her overlooked, unmarried, marginalized stepsister might become a duchess while Adelaide remained the wife of a banking merchant was a reorganization of the universe she found structurally unacceptable. She expressed this through comments designed to suggest that Cassian's interest was somehow illegitimate, that Annabella had engineered it through sympathy, or that he had been deceived about her actual circumstances. Daphne's reaction was sharp, worried jealousy, born from the fact that her engagement to a baronet's son, which had been the great triumph of the season, was now rather overshadowed. Violette's reaction was the most theatrical and the most direct. It happened at a gathering in the second week of November, when Cassian came to a Thursday afternoon tea, and Violet made sure to be present. She arrayed herself carefully, wore her best afternoon gown, and deployed the full considerable arsenal of her natural beauty and practiced charm. She laughed easily, offered interesting observations, directed her warmth at Cassian with the focused attention of a woman who was accustomed to being the most compelling person in any room. He was perfectly courteous to her. He was also entirely uninterested. He kept turning back to Annabella. He kept finding the thread of what Annabella was saying and picking it up again. He had a way of making Annabella the gravitational center of every conversation without appearing to try, simply by paying attention where his attention actually was. Violet was smart enough to understand what this meant. She left the tea early with a smile that was a little too bright, and Annabella heard her, later that evening, in heated whispered conversation with Lady Vivienne about the injustice of it. The outright warfare began the following week. It arrived in the form of rumors, spread through the society network with careful indirection, so that their source was not obvious. Annabella had pursued the Duke deliberately. Annabella had manufactured an opportunity with the maid and the crystal glasses to attract his attention, a calculation disguised as kindness. Annabella was older than she appeared and had misrepresented herself. Annabella was, underneath the quiet manner, a manipulative woman who had been calculating this outcome for months. The rumors reached Annabella through Mrs. Hodge, who repeated them in a quiet, furious voice that morning while handing over the tea. Annabella received them with a stillness that came from practice, though her hands, below the level of the table, tightened around the cup. She had been named as the author of a scheme she had never planned, in connection with a feeling she had not asked for, and the names behind the rumors were familiar ones. She had not thought it could still hurt, after all these years, to be misrepresented by people who knew exactly who she was. She had been wrong about that. The reckoning came from an unexpected direction. Cassian arrived on Tuesday for their usual walk, and he was not quite himself. He was courteous, as always. But there was something in his manner that was slightly more contained than usual, a slight drawing in, as though he had heard something that had required him to reassert his defenses. They were in the garden, well past the formal beds and into the winter-bear orchard before he said, without preamble, "There are things being said." "I know," she said. "I would like to hear from you what is true and what is not." She looked at him, this measured, careful, guarded man who had extended himself toward her, with a courage that she understood, now was real and not easy. She said, "Nothing about the glasses was calculated. I simply saw someone frightened and did what any person with ordinary human feeling would do. If someone attributed strategy to it, that is their own way of seeing the world, not mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is what I thought. There is nothing behind me but what you have already found," she said, and her voice was steady because she meant it. "No scheme, no calculation. I am, as far as I know, exactly who I appear to be." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He said quietly, with the particular quality of a person who does not say vulnerable things often, "I was told, years ago, by someone I trusted, things that were also exactly who she appeared to be. She was not. The space between them held that. She did not move to fill it with reassurance. She understood that what he had said was not a request for reassurance. It was an explanation, an offer of context. It was the thing beneath the closed door, the reason for the distance, the source of the cold that everyone noticed in him, and that was not, she now understood, coldness at all but caution, old, earned, entirely reasonable caution. "I know," she said softly. "I understand that." 2 weeks later, it rained. She was returning from the East Wing when the first drops began, large and cold, the particular November rain that means business. And she ran for the nearest shelter, which was the old stone gazebo at the edge of the formal garden. She arrived breathless and laughing slightly at herself, shaking the rain from her coat, and turned to find that she was not alone. He was there. He must have been walking and caught the same rain from a different direction. He stood at the far side of the gazebo, also lightly damp, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the grey, rain-enclosed quiet, and the absurdity of it was so completely human that he almost smiled, and she completely did. They stood at the rail of the gazebo and watched the rain move across the garden. He stood close to her, closer than their usual public distance, because the gazebo required it. She was aware of him with every part of her. "Do you miss the life you had before all of this?" he said, after a long quiet. She thought about it honestly. "I miss having been believed in," she said. "I do not miss anything else." He turned to look at her profile. She felt the weight of his attention the way one feels weather, with the whole body. "I believe in you," he said. It was so simple, so direct in the way only very certain things are direct. She turned to face him. His face was close and very serious, and the grey eyes held something in them that she recognized without warning, with a clarity that reached backward 8 years, and forward into something she had not let herself imagine. He raised his hand slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who was entirely sure of what he was doing, and placed the lightest possible pressure of his fingers at her temple, and then her forehead, where he allowed them to rest a moment. Her eyes closed. The rain continued. The grey garden received it. The stone walls of the gazebo held the warmth they had gathered from the autumn that had just passed. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her with an expression that made every careful wall she had ever built feel, briefly, unnecessary. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Chapter 7, The Royal Autumn Ball, was the largest event of the London social season. It was held at Ashmore House, the private London residence of Lord and Lady Ashmore, who had hosted it annually for 30 years, and it had grown over those decades into something that outran its own origins. It was attended by 300 guests at minimum, and the list this year included a duke, 4 earls, 6 baronets, 2 members of the cabinet, and the highest reaches of the church. Everyone of any consequence in England was there, and a great many people of no particular consequence who had managed to obtain an invitation through creative social engineering. Annabella had no difficulty obtaining an invitation. She had received it 3 weeks before the ball in a letter from Lady Ashmore herself, which had surprised her until she remembered that Lady Ashmore was a woman who paid attention to social developments and adjusted her guest list accordingly. She dressed carefully the evening of the ball. She had a new gown, the first new gown she had purchased for herself from her own small savings in 4 years. It was midnight blue, and it suited her. She had no diamonds. She wore the seed pearl strand, as always, and she put them on with deliberate intention, because they were her mother's, and tonight of all nights, she wanted her mother's company. She arrived at Ashmore House in the family carriage, which required a careful navigation of the social geography within it. Lady Vivian arranged beside her like a woman accompanying a newly valuable asset, Violet and Daphne opposite, Adelaide and her husband in the forward seats. Nobody spoke about what they were all thinking. Ashmore House blazed. The entry hall alone held 24 candelabras, and the great ballroom beyond it was a cathedral of light, white and gold, filled with the sound of 300 voices and an orchestra. Annabella stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel the beauty of it, separate from everything else, simply as a thing. Then she went in. Cassian had not yet arrived. She knew he had been invited. She did not know if he would come. She had made a decision in the quiet of the previous evening that whatever this was or was not, she would not arrange herself around expectation. She'd had done that enough in her life, shaped herself to the requirements of other people's desires and definitions. If he was here tonight, and if something occurred, she would receive it. If he was not, she would also receive that. She was 31 years old, and she had survived enough to know that she was not a woman who required rescuing. She was a woman who had learned carefully and over considerable time to be her own sufficient company. She did not need Cassian Veilheart. The recognition that she wanted him, however, his mind and his company, and his steadiness and the particular way he looked at her, was too honest to evade. She moved through the room, spoke to people she knew, accepted a glass of punch she sipped without tasting, and kept her face pleasantly composed. Lady Celeste Hawthorne was present, in the same deep gold that she seemed to favor, and their paths crossed near the floral arrangement that ran the length of the east wall. Lady Celeste looked at her. Annabella looked back. Neither spoke, but Annabella understood, in the measuring quality of that brief mutual regard, that she was being assessed. She held it evenly and moved on. The stepsisters found her near the 2nd hour. It had been, until that point, a manageable evening, but Violet had been drinking freely from the champagne that circulated endlessly on silver trays, and Daphne had the heightened color of someone's suppressing something they had decided to release. Adelaide had positioned herself with the focused unhappiness of a woman who had come to the party she had spent the most time criticizing. It was Violet who spoke first, low and just between the 4 of them. "He will not come for you tonight," she said. It was not cruel, precisely. It was the tone of someone delivering what they believe to be a kindness. Men like him do not make decisions of this kind about women like us. Women like you, I mean. He is amusing himself. Do not make the mistake of believing it is more than that. Annabella looked at her youngest stepsister, at the beautiful restless face, and the champagne glass, and the engagement ring she had extended so triumphantly 2 weeks before. She saw, with a clarity she had not always possessed, what was underneath the performance. Violette was afraid. She had been afraid since the night of the waltz, and the fear had curdled into this. "Violette," she said quietly, "I hope Lord Farley makes you very happy. I mean that sincerely." Violette blinked. Adelaide made a sharp sound. "She is being condescending." "No," Daphne said slowly, watching Annabella with an expression that was harder to read. "I do not think she is." The orchestra began the third movement of the program, and the conversation was interrupted by a change in the room's atmosphere that was physical, palpable, the distinct alteration in the air pressure of a gathered crowd when a single point of focus enters. The announcement came from the majordomo at the top of the grand staircase. His Grace, Duke Cassian Valahart. The orchestra did not stop, but the conversations did. 300 people registered his entrance, each in their own way. The women registered it as they always did. The men registered it as men register the presence of another man of significant power. The cabinet members near the fireplace registered it as political calculation. He descended the staircase with the unhurried precision that was entirely his own, and he did not look at any of the considerable number of people looking at him. He looked for someone, and he found her, and he moved directly toward her without ceremony. Annabella watched him cross the room and felt, with a sudden clarity that cut through everything else, the full weight of what the past weeks had been, the garden walks, and the library, and the carriage rides in the rain, the conversation about Sebastian that she had not fully had, but that she knew he would listen to when she was ready, the forehead in the gazebo, and the particular quality of his voice, saying, "I believe in you," the way he had defended her, publicly and without drama, the Tuesday she had needed it. He had come. He stopped before her. 300 people were watching. Lady Celeste Hawthorne was watching from the east wall. The stepsisters were watching behind her. Lady Vivienne was watching from somewhere to the left. None of it reached her. He was in front of her, and he was looking at her with the grey eyes she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, and what was in them now was not containment. It was the thing behind the containment, the thing he had been building toward, careful and certain as a man who has been wrong before and is now very sure. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The room made a collective sound that was not quite a sound, an inhalation, a held breath, a suspension. He opened the box. Inside it was a ring, not enormous, not ostentatious, a deep sapphire, the color of the sea at depth, set in platinum and flanked by small diamonds. It was extraordinarily beautiful, and it was entirely like him. Precise, real, without performance. He spoke in a voice that was quiet enough to be private, but clear enough to be heard. "Miss Brent," he said, "Annabella." Her name in his voice for the first time. "I am not a man who has found this kind of certainty easy to come by," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise to you, because you deserve honesty, and I believe you already know it. I have been, for reasons of my own, which I believe you understand, someone who has kept a considerable distance between himself and the possibility of this." He paused, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what he was saying. "You are the kindest person I have encountered in 20 years of social obligation," he said. "Not kind as performance, not kind as strategy, kind as a matter of character, in circumstances that have done nothing to encourage it. You have more dignity than any person in this room, and more strength than most of them will ever be required to find. You have given me, in 6 weeks, something I had stopped believing was available to either of us." His voice was even and certain. He was not performing. He was simply saying true things, in front of 300 people, who were now entirely still. I am not asking you because of your family's name, or your position, or what society expects, or what anyone in this room thinks. I am asking you because of who you are. Because I would like, for the rest of my life, to know what you think about the books you read, and the people you help, and the world you see more clearly than anyone I have ever met. He looked at her. Will you marry me? The years sat between those words and her answer. The mornings of cold water and household lists, the mealtimes with the careless cruelties, the long nights after Sebastian's letter, the overheard conversation about being unnecessary, the 31 years of managing, enduring, continuing without expectation of anything more, and him, this steady, guarded, impossible man who had crossed a ballroom and asked her to dance, and come back again, and who was now on one knee before her, with his heart in his hands, and no performance in his face. She felt everything she had held very still for a very long time come loose all at once, and she did not fight it, and it was not weakness, it was relief. It was the particular relief of someone who has been holding a thing tightly for so long that the release of it feels like returning to a natural state. Her eyes filled, she let them. Yes, she said. Her voice was quiet and entire. Yes, Your Grace. Cassian, he said, rising, and placing the ring on her finger with careful hands. My name is Cassian. Yes, Cassian, she said. I will marry you. The ballroom erupted. 300 people spoke at once, and the orchestra, after a half-moment of stunned silence, broke into a triumphant surge of music. Ladies who did not know Annabella applauded. Men clapped. Somewhere behind her, she heard a sound she had never heard before. Adelaide Foss, with nothing to say. She looked up at him, and found that the expression on his face was the one she had seen once before. Briefly, in the waltz, that unguarded, unperformed thing, except that now it was not brief. It was simply present, and she understood with the clarity of a person seeing something true that it would remain. He offered his arm. She took it. They stood together in the middle of the ballroom, in the middle of England, in the full light of 300 witnesses. And she was not invisible, and she was not at the end of any table, and she was not unnecessary. She was exactly, precisely, completely where she was supposed to be. What a journey. The woman they mocked for years is no longer standing alone at the edge of the ballroom. The step-sister they called a burden has just become the future Duchess of Valahart, and the same people who laughed at her now stand speechless before the life she built without ever losing her kindness. If Annabella and Cassian's love story has touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe. Leave a like and drop a comment telling me your favorite moment in the story and where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more unforgettable Victorian romance stories filled with love, heartbreak, and happily ever afters. Thank you for being here.